Honorable Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, President Samir Saran of the Observer Research Foundation, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, distinguished guests, let me welcome you all for this evening's panel discussion. It's a special delight for me to be part of this event, which is to mark the release of Rakesh's book. Rakesh has been a dear friend, and it's even more of a pleasure here to sit with Ambassador Shyam Saran, Shekhar Gupta, and Manpreet Sethi to discuss some of the ideas that we've already seen present this afternoon. I had the privilege of working with all three of them at different times, with Shyam Saran, Shekhar, and Manpreet. So all three, I think, bring very important perspectives to the question of the nuclear order. Now, I think before I go further, I think I really want to congratulate the Observer Foundation for getting this book out. It's putting together perspectives from around the world. But as is so often true in life, timing is the key. That is, you can have a fantastic book which nobody will notice, but if you have a book at the right time, at the right place, at the right moment, its impact, its relevance gets so much more traction. Today, I think the context in which the book is being released, I think, is important, and I think hopefully our panel will engage with it. First is let me point to three broad dimensions of the change that is taking place, and I think dealing with this is critical as we look ahead. The first is the collapse of the old order and the complete public disinterest in the collapse of this order. Shekhar will know that 30 years ago, when the INF treaty was being negotiated, it was kind of headlines on a daily basis of what Gorbachev and Reagan were doing. 10 years ago, when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was negotiating the nuclear deal, I think he had to go to the parliament with a confidence motion. I think it tells you how much of a public engagement was there with this issue. But today, President Trump says, I've just scrapped the INF treaty, yawn. It's not even on the front pages of the American papers anymore. Your President Putin stands up the last week and he said, I'm doing this new missile called hypersonic missile that is going to travel faster than sound, is going to undo everything the Americans have done in relation to missile defense, etc. Now they yawn. And then we have actually President Xi Jinping says he's going to devise the technology of everything. It's called artificial intelligence. And that's going to change everything we know in the world, including the nuclear politics. That too doesn't get much of an attention. Quite clearly, there are other dystopias. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, nuclear issue was the principal dystopia of a nuclear war, induced disaster was one of the principal dystopic concerns. But today, climate change, a whole range of other concerns exist, and the nuclear issue has long ceased to be the kind of one that draws people's attention, whether good or bad. You scare people, but people are not willing to be scared today that the nuclear weapons are somehow dangerous. But I think that itself is the danger. I think so that we need to engage with that. The second paradox, I would think, is really the President Trump again. I think the disruption that President Trump has induced into the way we think about nuclear politics, certainly in the regions. There are no shortage of people who criticize President Trump. He's got a lot of criticism. Samir referred to JCPOA, the Iran deal. So you'd think Trump is a bad president who's actually tearing up multilateral, bilateral, plurilateral treaty agreements. But then you are hard pressed to explain why is he trying to negotiate this big deal with the Koreans. After all, he said he's in love with Kim Jong-un. We'll see it next week. President is traveling. Normally, Ambassador Justice is here, and he'll tell you how difficult it is to get the American presidents to travel, certainly to Asia, far corners of Asia. President Trump traveled last year, go all the way to have the first ever meeting with the North Korean leader in Singapore. And then he's traveling all the way to Vietnam this week to sit down with Kim Jong-un. So those who think what he's done with Iran is bad must also explain why is he trying to construct a new agreement with someone who's no American president, no world leader was willing to think was possible. So there's something interesting here that is happening. For there are people who think both are bad, of engaging Iran or of negotiating with Kim. But the key is this, that Trump is changing the rules. The rules by which we have measured, we have judged regional nuclear politics, that Trump is changing the way we think about it. In fact, I would think the principal change is brought about it. It is not how many kilograms of plutonium or uranium that Kim or the Ayatollahs in Iran have. This is about the nature of the regime. Is it possible to construct a different political relationship? That is, the argument in the Middle East, if we talk to our Saudi friends, we talk to our Israeli friends, or we talk to our Emiratis, they say the problem is not just about how many nuclear weapons Iran has. This is about the nature of what it does to Iranian behavior in the region. Now, we don't have to agree with it, but this is about finding the balance, of finding security. This is not about eliminating nuclear weapons for their own sake. Similarly, in Korean Peninsula, a deal tomorrow, this week, or any kind, The Economist has already come out a few hours ago saying there'll be a small bad deal. So don't worry, it's not going to be a big bad deal, but a small bad deal. That for the establishment in Washington and many other, anything Trump does with Kim is a bad deal. But I think it has the potential to alter the geopolitics of the Korean Peninsula, of changing the way the structure of the Northeast Asian politics is being organized. That is, if there is inter-Korean reconciliation, if Americans and the Koreans establish diplomatic relations, starting with intersections, and if the two Koreas agree to a peace agreement and de-escalate the military conflict, we're talking about a fundamentally new situation for the first time since 1953. So there is actually a structural change that Trump disruption is producing, and dealing with that is quite important. And lastly, the Pulwama attack. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you will have questions to ask. There was a time, you remember, this has been going on since '87, when the first brass tacks, Shekhar in India Today, I think many cover stories were done on that, and since then we had crisis every second year, third year. In the process, of course, every time there was a temperature rose between India and Pakistan, the good doctors from Washington and London showed up and said, Kashmir is the biggest dangerous nuclear flashpoint, guys, we're going to separate you, sit down, talk, or whatever. But this time, the American president and Bolton is saying, India has the right to self-defense. They never said this before. So quite clearly, there's something is changing in our structure, environment. And Rakesh's book talks about the second nuclear age. But I think much of the problem with our analysis and argumentation is still the first nuclear age. We're still operating by the assumptions of the first nuclear age, where actually a second nuclear age is unfolding. So I've talked too much, I'm going to stop here. What we're going to do is, I'm going to ask Rakesh to say a few words about the book. And then we'll go to the three panelists, maybe a first round of very short, crisp comments of 3 minutes each. And then we'll have a couple of rounds of exchanges on the stage. And then we'll go to the podium for the audience for a question and answer session. So Rakesh.
Thank you, Raj. Let me first of all thank Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh for being here this evening. I'm also very grateful to the ORF for staying with me through this long period of gestation of this project. But it's not an easy job to get 11 people in different parts of the world contribute a chapter each on a common theme. The reason why I worked on this, Raj, was essentially that at one level, nuclear stockpiles had increased to more than 60,000 during the 1970s and 80s. Today they are down by 75% to 15,000 or less. So in some ways, we should be feeling more reassured. The NPT, which is often described as the cornerstone of nuclear agreements, today has 190 countries as parties. It is the most widely adhered to treaty in the world in the field of arms control and disarmament. There are only 4 countries that are outside it: India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. So by all accounts, the NPT has been enormously successful. So once again, we should be feeling more confident about the future, about the nuclear future. But the actual reality is that there is a growing anxiety as to whether the taboo that has prevented the use of nuclear weapons since 1945 can actually stick for another 70 years. And people are uncertain. And the reason is very straightforward, that the political order that was there underlying the 20th century has changed fundamentally, and that has contributed to enormous uncertainties in the nuclear landscape. It was an age, the Cold War age, and so in a sense nuclear stability between US and the USSR constituted strategic stability. So there was a straight equation between nuclear stability and strategic stability. That no longer holds. Nuclear stability does not necessarily equal strategic stability today. And therefore we have become used to looking at the nuclear equation in terms of dyads, two-player game, US and Soviet Union in the old days. Today there are many players, but we still try to link it and reduce it to two-player games. Even if we are successful in finding two-player models, the fact is that there is no model today which is not linked in the form of a nuclear chain to another nuclear dyad. Whether it is US-Russia, which would be linked to China, whether it is India-Pakistan, which would be linked to China, which would be linked to other countries, whether it is US-North Korea, which would again bring in China, or any other equation will bring in the other players. So it is no longer a stand-alone equation that we had become familiar with during the Cold War. The second thing that was referred to is technology. In 1945 was when we discovered the E is equal to mc square and worked out how to explode a nucleus. Today, that is old hat. I mean, the kind of computing power that exists on a cell phone is more than the computing power that was used to design the first nuclear device. So while, yes, the number of countries that have nuclear weapons has remained relatively limited, but it is a science and technology which is now much more easily understood and much more easily accessible. And to top it all, command and control systems, early warning systems, and the like, on which nuclear stability was based, are today increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks, to outer space vulnerabilities, satellite-linked vulnerabilities, and the like. So what it does is, it actually compresses decision-making times. And in that compressed decision-making time, the chances of an accidental or miscalculation leading to an accident become much, much higher. We defined nuclear deterrence in an age that was seen as an age of two Western leaders. Today, we have to redefine deterrence for a different age. How does nuclear deterrence, what does it look like in an age when we are dealing with a different nature of threats, whether it is terrorism, whether it's fanaticism, or whether it is nationalism? For understanding this, and this was what was underlying this project, and that is how I was able to approach the different contributors, to whom I'm very grateful for having taken time out and given us this manuscript, is that we have to overcome certain ways of thinking. Dr. Manmohan Singh, he said very presciently that the hardest thing to change is the human mind. And this is why we need to overcome certain cognitive biases in our own thinking if we have to look for a nuclear order for the 21st century. Unless we are able to identify the problem, we can't find a solution. And so therefore we have to understand that arms control as was practiced, even though it reduced nuclear weapons by 75%, was not actually disarmament. Because the salience of nuclear weapons in security doctrines did not actually come down. The number of nuclear weapons may have come down, but not the importance of nuclear weapons in security doctrines. Second thing which we need to understand is that we may have delegitimized nuclear proliferation, but we never succeeded in delegitimizing nuclear weapons. The NPT was converted into a treaty which, instead of imposing a special responsibility on the P5, the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT, actually became a license for these 5 countries to retain their weapons in perpetuity. So unless we accept this, unless we accept that, in a sense, the existing order is now out of sync, and therefore that approach of arms control where US and Soviet negotiators would sit down and say, okay, now we're going to reduce our arsenals from 18,000 to 15,000 each, or something like that. That approach will not work in today's age of asymmetry. And so what we've tried to do in this publication, in this project that we've undertaken at the ORF, is to see what can be the contours of a new order, because the old template will not work. And meanwhile, the most important thing, therefore, is to ensure that while we grope our way towards a new order, nuclear weapons don't end up getting used, because any use would be catastrophic. And I think we need to go back to first principles for that. We need to understand from the very basic principles that as long as one country has nuclear weapons, it creates a legitimate reason for others to also justify their acquisition. As long as nuclear weapons exist, sometime or the other, they will tend to get used. And we need to accept that any use will have catastrophic consequences. So I think if we go back to these fundamental principles and then start looking at how to create a stable regime, and that this publication is an attempt at putting out some pointers in that direction. Not all the chapter writers agree with each other. In fact, there is a divergence of views among the chapter writers, some reflecting their own country's positions and some reflecting their own specificities. But at the same time, what comes out is an agreement that the nuclear taboo is too vital to allow it to be breached. And so I'm very grateful to you, Raj, and to Ambassador Shamsaran, to Manpreet and Shekhar for also agreeing to be part of the panel, and to all of you for joining us this evening.
That initial set of remarks. Now, I'm going to start with Ambassador Shamsaran, and then Manpreet, and then Shekhar. Maybe just a couple of minutes of opening remarks of what you think about the book, and also the kind of issues that we've already started discussing. Ambassador.
Let me begin by congratulating my friend Rakesh for what has been really a seminal contribution, I think, in terms of at least creating a platform for a very, very necessary discourse on some very vital issues relating to international peace and security. I read the book with great interest. As he says, there have been a number of contributions from important stakeholders, countries which have a big stake in the nuclear issue, and it gives you a sense of the complexity of the situation that we are facing. Rajamohan, you said we don't seem to be as scared of a nuclear Holocaust as perhaps in the past. I think there are so many things to be scared of these days that I'm not surprised that this has sort of fallen off the radar screen somewhat. We are, in a sense, living in a very dystopian world. I think what the book really focuses attention on two things. One is that this drama is being played out in a world where there are very, very elemental, I would say, geopolitical shifts which are taking place. And therefore, it is no surprise that those shifts are also impacting on the manner in which we deal with issues of international peace and security. So somehow the nuclear order is linked together with what may be the emerging global order. So I think unless we look at these two together, it may not be easy to really start finding answers. And the second aspect which has come out very clearly is the technology aspect. That technological advancement has added very new dimensions to this whole issue of the nuclear order. I'll just take one example. All, I think, contributors agree that the importance of nuclear weapons is because of its role as a deterrent. Is nuclear weapons now performing the role of a deterrent? And the fact is that today, as a result of technology, you have the empowerment of what we call non-state actors, or even what the United States would call rogue states. The knowledge is very different from what it was before. Rakesh pointed out, the computing power that is available today in a cell phone is much more than what was available when the nuclear weapon was being designed. That's a fact. But what it is doing is that it is empowering non-state actors against whom deterrence is irrelevant. How are you going to react to, say, a nuclear attack which is carried out by, say, a terrorist group within your own territory? Or if it is carried out, or if there is an attack from the territory of a friendly country, or even an ally. So these are very fundamental issues which are raised as a result of the advance of technology. Lastly, I think we also have to recognize that any answer that we are looking for can no longer be something which is confined to a small group of so-called nuclear weapon states. I think the stakes that non-nuclear weapon states, all the other countries that you have mentioned who are part of the non-proliferation treaty, they have as important a stake, perhaps even more, than nuclear weapon states. So if we are looking at a future platform on which we can address some of these issues, that platform necessarily has to be a multilateral platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Manmohan Singh, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special privilege and honor to be part of this panel of such renowned people in the nuclear domain. And I am extremely honored to be here to discuss an excellent contribution to the current issues on nuclear matters, which are exercising minds that look at nuclear problems in today's times. My compliments to the editor for bringing together such well-established authors who are both practitioners as well as scholars, looking at the various dimensions of the current nuclear order. My only grudge, sir, is that there are no women authors in the book. And I think they have a voice too that must be heard. Apart from that, I commend you for prescribing such a good length for all the articles. They are very neatly divided into sections and subsections, which makes it very easy to read, and I would commend the book to all of you. Now, it's already been mentioned as to what are some of the issues on which most of the authors in the book agree on in terms of what are the current contours of the nuclear disorder. We've already mentioned the number of players is much more than it was at the bipolar, Cold War period. There are chain relations instead of dyadic relations that existed in the past. There are emerging technologies which are intersecting with the idea of nuclear deterrence in ways which hasn't been seen earlier. And then, we've referred to the asymmetries that exist in the capabilities and the doctrines of the many players in the nuclear field. I want to flag just 3 points which are not mentioned in the book. I would commend each one of you to actually read the book. But there are these 3 factors which are also complicating the nuclear order, and they are not mentioned in the book. One of this, when we mention asymmetries of technology and capability, I think there is also an asymmetry in the desire for strategic stability amongst the nuclear players today. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Cold War bipolar structure, the 2 countries desired strategic stability. So they move towards an architecture of arms control, etc., in order to create a certain sense so that crisis will not run out of control and that arms race will not run out of control. But what we see in today's times amongst the 9 nuclear armed states that exist around the world, many of them don't desire strategic stability today. You know, it was referred to by Dr. Raja Mohan about the complacency that has set in. And we find many of these players, and particularly in our neighborhood, both China and Pakistan look at the idea of instability in order to enhance their nuclear deterrence. So every time a Pulwama kind of an attack happens, Pakistan actually likes to play up the nuclear shadow because that's the way that it deters India from any conventional action. So the desire for strategic stability, there is a huge asymmetry amongst nations, and I think that is a complicating factor. The second dimension is on the jettisoning of the concept of mutual vulnerability as a way of underpinning deterrence. Countries today, when we are talking about America first, China dream, India first, you know, Russia making such a strong case for its own military hardware, all of this is essentially sense of absolute security that nations want. So no one is looking at what is mentioned in the book as cooperative management of security, where you were looking at vulnerability actually underpinning and anchoring the idea of nuclear deterrence. But in today's times, when the nuclear posture review of the US that came out just last year talks about the idea of limited nuclear war, or that, you know, we can escalate to de-escalate kind of a strategy, those concepts make it extremely complicated for a nuclear order then to be established. And the last point on the complicating factors is that this nuclear age is far removed in space and time from what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And public memory is often very short. So we are already beginning to, you know, forget the horrors. We only talk about mere statistics when we say that, you know, 60,000, 80,000 people vaporized within minutes. But it's just a statistic in our mind. No longer is that horror internalized. And we've seen the kind of brutality we have in terms of violence in recent times, which has desensitized us to a certain extent. And therefore, in a rather cavalier fashion, you have President Trump or President Putin talking about the idea of a limited nuclear war, that we could use low-yield weapons, without understanding that even those low-yield weapons were banned by the US Congress at a certain point in time because they were not seen to be limiting the horrors of the use of that particular weapon. So my sense is that the nuclear order is extremely complicated, which is what we all agree on. And I have my views on what is the biggest risk that comes out of this order and how we could mitigate them. But let me keep them for the next round.
Well, thank you very much. I'm here mostly to learn. 3 of these people I've had the pleasure of learning from over time. Raja as a colleague, Rakesh as a friend for 30 years, and Shyam as a columnist and somebody who I read all the time, and also learning from him talking. And Manjeet, this is a new one, and I accept your complaint, and I think we have to rectify this. Even on our op-ed pages, we have to have more women talking about issues like this. This book is interesting, but for me, the most interesting thing is that I think it's the first time in more than a decade since the nuclear deal, it's the first time that I've come, forget speaking at, but I've come to attend an event on the nuclear issue. Because somehow it was, I used an expression in my last column, nuclear lazy. I do get the feeling that somehow our strategic community became lazy after the nuclear deal, because they thought this was now a done deal. You had stability and deterrence in the region, and then you had global legitimacy, and now nothing more needed to be done. So this whole change in the world, first of all, the ease with which nuclear weapons were developed by other countries, and as Rakesh said, the fact that this then got complicated by many bilateral challenges. There is Iran and Israel, there is North Korea and South Korea, there is India and Pakistan, there is China and everybody, there is America and Russia. I do think that we have not thought about this very much. We haven't written about this very much. I don't think we've published very much about this. When we get an article on a nuclear issue, there is a yawn. Talk about Rafale, right? talk about the shortage of fighter plane squadrons. So this is a forgotten issue, but I'm glad that this is now coming back, because what we've seen now is that some countries, we got nuclear stability because nations saw nuclear weapons as a deterrent, fundamentally. But many nations now see nuclear weapons not as a deterrent. They see nuclear weapons as a proactive instrument to be used proactively, under the shadow of which you could do many things. This applies to Iran, this applies to North Korea, this also applies definitely to Pakistan in different ways. Some countries might think this gives them negotiating power. North Korea might think it gives them negotiating power. So Donald Trump has to go flying again and again because if he can settle, it's a big deal for him. Iranians, it gives them power vis-a-vis the Saudis and the Arab world, in the Muslim world. Pakistan has now completely internalized the idea that there cannot be a war because nobody can be as nutty as us. And I believe they're making a mistake now. And if they continue like this, all of us may end up paying for it, and they'll pay more because it's a miscalculation. So different nations took different lessons from nuclear weapons. And in my sort of more irreverent moments earlier, when Parakram etc. were taking place, I used to say that many people think that what's a nuclear weapon? It's just an oversized daisy cutter. You will drop it, some people will die, then you will carry on. So public opinion by and large has stopped understanding the implications of nuclear weapons. If I see the Pakistani media, if I see the Pakistani commentariat last 2 weeks, I find enormous writing about Nasr missiles having been deployed up front, including pictures of Nasr launchers being taken ahead. First of all, everybody is cool in Pakistan that now we are doing this, we'll drop these 10 low yield weapons and Indians will be incinerated. But I find there is no reaction on the Indian side. Nobody is even bothering, there is no reaction forget the government, but there is no reaction in the commentariat. And that is a very worrying thing. I think we have now begun to take nuclear weapons for granted, that they are where they are. If the Pakistanis drop something, we'll drop 100 times more at them. The Chinese, in any case, will not drop anything at us. So the world has by and large distanced itself with nuclear weapons when more and more irresponsible states are getting these. And these irresponsible states, their statehood, their position in the world is not a done deal. They are impatient to change it. And how do they change it? I think many of them are thinking that we can change it because we have these weapons. So as I said, one for negotiations, North Korea, one for power in the Muslim world, and one Pakistan just to keep India off balance forever. And one bluff can be called, two bluffs can be called, but even if one bluff is called anywhere, there'll be big trouble. I do still think that Russia and America will still manage.
Thank you, Shekhar. I think I'm just going to ask 2 rounds of questions, and before we go to the floor, I'll ask Rakesh to respond to some of the highlights. Please feel free to jump in anytime. The first question I want to ask the 3 panelists is, while we talk about the second nuclear age, I mean, we still saw first nuclear age. There, I think, has India come to terms fundamentally with the change? That is, while the tropes that we've used to debate with the world in the first nuclear age, disarmament, what is it, time-bound elimination of nuclear weapons, as I used to tweak Manpreet and Rakesh for a long time, delegitimization, multilateral negotiations in CD in Geneva. Much of that now, when actually there is a treaty saying we want to stop the use of nuclear weapons, India is not going to sign it. There's a new treaty, nuclear prohibition treaty, India is not going to sign it. There is the CTBT, which we said for a long time. When anybody said NPT, we said CTBT. Now we're not going to sign the CTBT. There's a whole complex politics to it. But I'm not criticizing government. All I'm saying is, if you say we need to come to terms with the structural change, the old framework of disarmament, delegitimization, they're no longer relevant. Because it's not going to happen. I mean, I think you had repeated examples that it's not going to happen. And then on top of it, it took you 24 years from telling your first test is a peaceful nuclear explosion, 74, to 98 to say it's actually normal nuclear weapon. Now, are we ready for the second nuclear age? Because Samir in his opening remarks said, now we must take the leadership. You say it in your book. Are we ready intellectually to argue balance of power is the key thing? This is not about disarmament. This is not about elimination. This is not about lion lying down with the lamb. Are we ready to integrate nuclear weapons into a broader concept of balance of power in the world? So maybe all three of you, I'll start with Ambassador.
You have already pointed out how there has been a change in the manner in which India has been responding to some of the proposals at, for example, the multilateral level concerning nuclear weapons. But I think there is perhaps a not enough of an understanding that first of all you determine what your interests are, what your substantive interests are. How you package that is a different matter. And I see no issue at all if India still maintains that nuclear disarmament is important, even while it does what is necessary in order to keep the balance in its favor. And I think one should go further and say that even if we are looking at India's interests in a somewhat longer term, I think the point that was made when we had our nuclear doctrine, that India still believes that its interests are better served in a world free of nuclear weapons than in a world which has nuclear weapons. And I think it's an important truth. One is, as I said, let us determine what our interests are in the world which has been described by Rakesh in their book. This is a world of multiple nuclear weapon states. It is a world where you can no longer deal with this in binaries. Therefore, we will have to look at how our interests are going to be impacted by this interconnectedness. But at the same time, I think India championing the cause of nuclear disarmament, taking that high moral ground, and also recognizing that in the long term, yes, nuclear disarmament is in India's interest. This is something which I think we are already, in a sense, doing.
Yes, sir. And as you said, the first nuclear age is still very predominant on our thinking. But there are some concepts of the first nuclear age which haven't lost their value and relevance. And I think there's no harm in acknowledging those. And I would think disarmament and the idea of strategic stability are some things that must come into the next nuclear age in order to provide for a sense of nuclear order. On disarmament, Ambassador Shamsaran has, pretty much echoed my thoughts on it as well, that it is in India's long-term interest to continue to argue for disarmament, even if it doesn't look realistic that we will move towards that kind of a end state right now. But even so, I mean, it's my hope that at some stage in my life I will own a Bentley. Even if I don't see myself moving towards it, it is in my interest to continue to pursue that, and I think it is in India's interest to continue to hope for disarmament, but at the same time being realistic about the kinds of threats that we are facing today. And therefore, I don't see a dichotomy in the idea of pursuing credible deterrence at the same time as you're also looking for disarmament. There are separate forums which are, which are existing for pursuing those approaches, and there's no harm in India for doing that. But there are new risks that exist, which we have spoken about, and in that, the biggest risk that I find is the idea of inadvertent escalation. It's been spoken about how technologies will lead us towards that. What if you were seeing a hypersonic missile coming at you, or the idea that a cyber attack could cripple your command and control and therefore tempt you towards preemption? So if these are the risks that exist today, when disarmament is not in the picture, then we must find ways of mitigating these risks, of reducing the dangers that we are facing. And in that context, besides disarmament, I think India could be formalizing certain proposals at the multilateral level in order to get nations to try and reduce the dangers to the extent possible. One of them could be, for instance, formalizing low alert levels. The fact that India, Pakistan, China do have low alert levels. We don't have our missiles at hair trigger readiness. We don't have our missiles on, completely mated form. Can we ask for multilaterally also for that situation to come about? Non-targeting of command and control or nuclear assets. These are some of the ideas that India must throw out. They are not going to be easy to achieve. There are very many problems that will stand in the way. But the ideas, including what Ambassador Rakesh Sood said about reducing the salience of nuclear weapons, the idea of a universal no first use that India has aired millions of times. It hasn't taken very many people to agree to that, but the world is changing, and as the dangers come out more alive, I think there will be takers for some of the ideas that India should begin to throw out to the outside world.
Shekhar, can you separate the propaganda and policy? Good wishes from actually outcomes.
My apologies for being a journalist, but I think we Indians have bored the world enough with our sanctimonious talk. Nobody's going to listen to us and start disarming themselves. I think our issues are very much in our region. India is in a peculiar state where you need nuclear weapons as a deterrent against one nation, that's China, and as maybe weapon of last resort or whatever against the other one, the nuttier one. So also this is a very different world. The biggest problem in the world is nobody trusts anybody. Today, even if you say disarm, will any leader in India trust Pakistanis with full disarmament now? Will any leader in Pakistan ever trust India with full disarmament now? You are looking at very simplified technologies. In fact, we are wrong. In fact, I'll correct it. I think both of you said that these phones have more computing power than the first computers on which the nukes were designed. These have more computing power than the supercomputer of the 90s. So many countries have non-state actors. Non-state actors can get control of something like this, or they can build something like this. So I think to talk disarmament now is what I call as CBMs, for which I call as conference building measures. You can start it and hold many conferences, but it's not going to happen. I think the problem right now is one, there is inadequate trust between nations, and second, there are very few leaders with moral authority in the world right now. I mean, go west to east, see Donald Trump, Putin, Abe, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, Netanyahu, Erdogan, Netanyahu. When you get bored, you have Duterte, and now you have that Hungarian guy and the Brazilian guy. This world is run by alpha males. Nobody trusts anybody. So who's the uncle in this world that people know? So I think we should just be ourselves, because people will leave the hall if you start lecturing them now. That movie is ended.
Shekhar, since you wrote a recent column, that's my second question, we'll go briefly on this. I mean, you wrote saying that, look, this is not about nuclear now, that India needs conventional military capability, where our defense expenditure has come down, our modernization has halted, we can't get enough planes. So, Manpreet was criticizing America's concept of limited war. I mean, limited war is in India's interest, right? I mean, it's India, George Fernandez, who talked about a limited war. That you need to break out of the nuclear blackmail that Pakistan has imposed on you. So idea of how do you use conventional military power, that's our problem as well. It's not just an American problem. So Shekhar, you highlighted that. I mean, so can you expand on that? What is it that we can do today instead of beating our breasts every time there is a conventional terror attack, we go into the same debate and nothing changes?
I think there is a miscalculation on the Pakistani side, which India has embraced much too readily and easily, which is that now that we have nuclear weapons, India cannot retaliate conventionally. As Imran Khan said last week, that if India retaliates, we will also retaliate. If India had built a sufficient gap in conventional military power. Today there is a gap, but there is sufficient gap for defending ourselves, or maybe punishing them for a day or two. It's not like the movies, right? Unlike the movie Uri, the Pakistanis will fight, right? In real life, the Pakistanis will fight. So why did we not build that? Why did we, wrongly in my view, accept this idea that now that we have the nukes and the Pakistanis have the nukes, you don't need a decisive conventional superiority. With this economic growth, you could have thrown the gauntlet at the Pakistanis that, look, I am now doing this, you can join the arms race. They can go and get what they want from the Chinese, but Chinese give you nothing for free. Today you have a situation where next year, because you have now politicized defense and politicized for domestic politics. Not just that. See, today, because you accepted, I mean, there are veterans here, pardon me for saying this, today, and I'm not saying OROP should not have been done or 7th Pay Commission should not have been done, but if OROP was done at this level and 7th Pay Commission was done, then the budget should have been increased as a percentage of GDP. You have a situation where next year your pension budget will exceed your salary budget for defense. Both greatly exceed your modernization and operations budget. So this is an army which I call suffering from General Belgrano syndrome. You remember the Argentinian cruiser, which was just sitting there to be sunk. So if India wants to do this, then India has to pay the price for it. But I think this laziness has come from thinking, now there are nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not our deterrent with Pakistan. Conventional weapons have to be India's deterrent with Pakistan. Similarly, conventional weapons have to be a deterrent with China, because you know that until you come to a stage where you have to use nuclear weapons on China, will be very late. So I just think that we've been complacent, and the whole commentariat, the rest of us, we just got bored. I mean, even if you look at the core of defense correspondents today, they are so tactical. Everything is tactical. This plane, this helicopter, wow, fantastic, right? So conventional has been forgotten and forgiven, and we are paying for it.
In fact, I just wrote a piece 2 days ago which was on what India should not be doing in the wake of Pulwama. And the first point I made was that India should not be deterred by the idea that Pakistan would use nuclear weapons, and therefore our conventional capability cannot come into play. You're right, sir. We haven't invested enough in building our conventional capability to bridge that gap. But limited war is certainly a possibility with Pakistan, and I think that is something we must speak about. And let not Pakistan get away with the idea that just because it has nuclear weapons and it tries to create that situation where nuclear weapons will be used the moment Indians take any first action, that is an idea that has to be dismissed. So limited, but what I was mentioning about the US is the idea of limited nuclear war. That is not in India's interest, and that is not an idea that India believes in. We believe that deterrence is the primary purpose of the nuclear weapon, not war fighting with nuclear weapons. And what President Trump and Putin and Pakistan and North Korea are beginning to tout in today's time is the idea that nuclear weapons can be used in a limited way and you can still get away with it. That is not in India's interest, and we must discount that. But the way out is to continue to believe that limited war is a possibility, for which not only do you have to do conventional acquisitions, but also do new kinds of conventional acquisitions to make that a possibility.
Well, first of all, a limited war is an oxymoron, because a war is not a cricket match. So you can say it's 20 overs, 50 overs, or 5 days, right? As Mr. Vajpayee once said to me, how you start, where you start, and when you start, a war is in your hands. How it ends, where it ends, and when it ends, you have no idea. So having said that, I do agree that a limited war means a punitive capability. India should go beyond the idea of limited war. India should go to a mindset of punitive capability, that India is so superior. There is an Israel fixation in India, and people say Israelis do it, we should do it, but Israelis, all of Israel's enemies are stateless. Even the Iranians have now got involved, but they are not fighting the state of Iran directly. That's a very different situation. That kind of asymmetry you will not have. But you have to build sufficient asymmetry in missiles, in fighter planes, in long-range artillery, in air defense ground environment system. Today Pakistan is better than ours. And other technologies whereby Pakistanis know that if we do something, they cannot retaliate. They cannot afford to retaliate. Because today, if it's a 7-day war will suit Pakistan also quite nicely. So that is not the thing. Your conventional capability, given the size of our economy and the size of our country and the respect our country enjoys, should be at the scale of 10x of what it is right now.
Well, I think, number one, I don't think that any country should put its political leadership in a situation of a binary choice. That is, either you engage in war or you engage in a peace. These are two ends of the spectrum. And I think what we have got ourselves into is precisely that kind of a binary situation. It is wrong to think that we do not have potentially the capability of actually changing the whatever may be the strategic calculation in Islamabad. But you need to put in place a whole range of what could be negative levers, what could be positive levers, which the leadership can choose how to put together in order to respond to what Pakistan is doing. They may be covert measures. What are the vulnerabilities which your adversary has that you can perhaps exploit? If Pakistan is worried about what India may be doing in Afghanistan, perhaps you should raise that level of anxiety. If Pakistan is worried about what you could be perhaps doing in Balochistan, you raise that level of vulnerability. You claim to have Gilgit and Baltistan as your own territory, but I don't see you doing anything at all in order to assert that claim. After the Simla agreement, we seem to have just given that up. So, I mean, I think when we speak about, what are we going to do now that we have had another attack, we do not utilize the time available to us to put these kind of levers in place, which cannot be done overnight. And I think the reason why we find ourselves in this particular position is precisely because we have not been able to do that.
Thank you. Two questions on one is can we adapt to a critical model of criticizing others for why they should have nice policies to one with adapting our own policies towards greater pragmatism, realism, understanding international. That was the issue in 95 to 98 when we were in the days. That how do we move away from the direction to actually creating nuclear weapons and dealing with that fear? The second is there a way out of the
nuclear deterrence problem that we have in Pakistan? So briefly, and then we'll go to the floor.
Well, I think in response to the first, I would say that yes, but what it requires is a change in mindset. I mean, what we tried to do was, we had during the 80s as sort of started approaching the notion of global nuclear disarmament as a utopian idea, not linked to India's national security. So there was a disconnect here that had come into play, as it were. With the tests and by reasserting the centrality of national security interests, we sought to bridge that gap and make our policy more reflective. And so therefore, there again, I mean, today, if we are not talking of nuclear disarmament, that is fine. But at the same time, we should be talking of nuclear stability, certainly, which also we are not really doing. So in that sense, we've become lazy, as Shekhar says. And I think that in order to be able to do that, we need to realign our posture, the initiatives that we take, with our national security interests, and to that extent, achieving nuclear stability and what is it that contributes to nuclear stability becomes vital. So therefore, linking it to the second thing, what do we do with vis-a-vis Pakistan? I think vis-a-vis Pakistan, what Ambassador Shamsaran said, is that you can't offer binaries, and this is precisely what has happened. And I think the problem for that is a longer problem, it's a deeper problem. It's not just a question of budget, as Shekhar pointed out. The budget has steadily come down for capital acquisitions. It is also a question of restructuring. What is the kind of conflict that we are facing? And we have had successive committees since Kargil that have come up with a series of recommendations which somehow or the other have not been implemented. So you need to restructure the nature of your forces in order to deal with today's threats rather than merely following the model that we have used in the past.
Thank you. I think we'll go to the floor now. We've got about 20 minutes or so. So I'll take 3 questions at a time, depending on how much time. So you ask short questions, we'll have a chance to go to more people. Yes, the lady here. Can you make it, make it short and sharp.
Hello, yes, basically it is established that malicious actions in cyberspace can cause mass disruption, bearing in mind technological advancements in the 21st century like 3D printing, which has already lowered barriers for the production of biological weapons, and the increasing sophistication in things like unmanned aerial vehicles, and the growing nexus between weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and cybersecurity, and how, bearing in mind, just the point being, bearing in mind all these things, all these technological advancements which could lead to non-state actors getting their hands on get
to the question. Yeah, just you're saying technology changes the context.
Yes, basically non-state actors getting their hands on nuclear
thanks.
power.
Yeah, right at the back. Yeah.
Hello, sir. So I had a book written edited by Subramanian, where you had also written an article, and that was in '86. It mentions about deterrence and how India is looking at a deterrence perspective, not as a dyad, but as in response to the overall architecture, deterrence architecture as it existed that day. But from then, again today, we are obsessed with this dyad with Pakistan and China. So somewhere down the line, we have lost the plot and gone into this dyad thing. So where do you think we have lost it as a strategic community?
Jan Chopra.
Okay, very quickly, back to Pulwama. Despite the nuclear taboo that the panel has talked about, or not obeying the nuclear taboo, what do we do? Do we extract this high price? Do we wait to be conventionally strong? In my view, we go ahead, whatever we have to do strategically or tactically, with what we have. We can't wait for all this to happen. Thank you.
Yeah, so Ambassador Shamsar, do you want to answer any of these?
Well, I think as far as the technology aspect is concerned, as it relates to the threat of nuclear weapons, I think it is quite apparent that the only possible solution, effective solution, is really the elimination of nuclear weapons. In fact, technology is going to advance further. Therefore, the threats that we are talking about are going to even grow. So rather than to sit back and say, well, there is nothing much that we can do about this, we just have to accept that this is going to be an increasing threat. The question is, are we prepared to sit down and talk about what this means? Because I think if we are looking at our interests in a very narrow frame, which then leads us to believe that the only answer is for us also to head in the same direction. And the problem is that not all these countries can head in the same direction, because you do not have the same kind of resources, you may not have the same kind of knowledge. Therefore, I think it is still my view that looking at our interests in a somewhat broader perspective and in a somewhat longer term perspective, leading the way to perhaps this eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, even if it does not happen immediately, is actually something which is in the enlightened self-interest of India.
Speak about the non-state actor question, huh? Yeah, since that was nuclear terrorism, I do believe even more than a deliberate nuclear war for India, Pakistan or any other country, nuclear terrorism is a threat. That is a nightmare scenario. But it's for that reason that President Obama had started this whole measures about nuclear security, because what he managed to do, and which was very much in India's interest, was to raise the profile of the threat of nuclear terrorism. So the idea that the non-state actor could somehow use fissile material, even in the form of an RDD, a radiological dispersal device, or what we call the dirty bomb, in order to remove such or minimize such possibilities, the idea of nuclear security was raised to the highest political level. The Prime Minister himself participated in several of the nuclear security summits that were held internationally. And I think what India can do in order to minimize chances of such a possibility is, one, plug into the international mechanisms that are today in place, because this is not just an Indian threat, it's a global threat today. And we can reap benefits or leverage our own threat because of the international global awareness on this particular issue. And the other is to build your own capability, whether it's in terms of nuclear forensics, whether it's in terms of better intelligence, better interdiction, better accounting, material accounting in our own country, in order to remove the possibility of orphan sources falling into the hands of the non-state actor. It's a tough question, but this is how we can answer it very quickly.
Well, I'll just say that what happens when distinction between non-state and state is not clear. You are today looking at that situation. You know, I am deeply disturbed by the thought that one country can think that it now has the power to influence coming elections in another country under the nuclear umbrella using non-state actors. And if you, I may not be referring to Pulwama, something happened in 2008 also. We don't know what the motive was. These things are not just done to go and kill a few people. So, so I think the state, non-state distinction is not so clear anymore. So you have to think in sort of in greater depth. And really, you know, I mean, I don't understand global nuclear issues. I don't have the intellect or the depth of knowledge or the reading. And Raja not working with us for some time has not helped. But really, I think we, I mean, if I want to have a better expression, we should first look after our own front yard and backyard. And then, you know, we don't understand this. We love to lecture the world hates us for it. They are polite, they never say it to us, but they really hate us for it. So we should stop doing it. I mean, if you encourage this, then you have a Prime Minister who actually believes that the world, he is the most giant intellectual, moral authority figure in the whole world. He'll start lecturing everybody.
No, this very, very interesting discussion prompts me to ask a basic question. Are you sure that you're not in the process of trying to review and reconsider the fundamentals? Are you not being willingly tracked by the same kind of arguments, the same kind of theories which have led us to the present juncture where there seems to be no solution? I want to say this because whatever you say about managing and trying to adjust still falls into the same deterrence trap. And the follies of that have actually come out and they stare us in the face. And this simple example is that if North Korea's deterrence works and forces the US president to come all the way, then what about the Soviet deterrence or Russian deterrence? So between these two deterrences, there is a big difference. So why did you need all those weapons then, if just 25 weapons of North Korea could do this? So there is something very fundamentally flawed about deterrence. And are you questioning that in this discussion?
There's a lot of discussion on increasing spending on conventional weapons. And I was wondering why this is the only alternative. Rather than sending more soldiers to the front line and having limited war, why don't you adopt, or why don't we consider, wouldn't it be more effective to consider adopting the Pakistani non-state actor attitude? It would save us a lot and that money can go elsewhere.
You have any human bombs in mind in India?
The Pakistanis found one in Pakistan, so I I don't see why.
So, my name is Kesav. I study peace and conflict from Jamia, sir. So, we were discussing the Trump's way of dealing with the things. I think President Trump's strength is unpredictability, that you can't guess what he can do or how he will deal with the things. So, in 2003, we came with a nuclear doctrine with the 5 nuclear debates. Do you think that we should have come with a nuclear debate where none of the country and none of the nuclear states have its nuclear doctrine? We should have unpredictable as far as the nuclear strategy is concerned.
Last round. Any other thoughts you want to add?
I think unpredictability is built into the very nature of nuclear weapons. You will never know what is the threshold until you have actually crossed that threshold. Much of the theory around nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence is just a mind game. You keep theorizing about what the thought process on the other side is, and then you try to adjust your own thought process accordingly. But as I said, at the end of the day, it's just a mind game, because once deterrence fails, everything that you are talking about in terms of the value of nuclear weapons then has also failed. So I think I think it is true that there is some value to unpredictability, but to my mind, let us not let that unpredictability tie our own hands. I think that also you have to be very confident that inside you are predictable, while you are making everybody else believe that you are unpredictable. That's a very difficult thing to achieve.
Some last thoughts, sir, and on the rather philosophical question that Master Shilkant Sharma raised about nuclear weapons and deterrence. I think as long as nuclear weapons exist, there is no getting away from deterrence. But we tend to add a lot of paraphernalia to deterrence, which is sometimes quite unnecessary. So I think while this point has been made several times from the panel to say that India has a rather moralist and a less pragmatist position on several of these issues, I don't think that's essentially correct. When we are making the case for disarmament, it's not just because it's morally or ethically the correct thing to do. It's also because it's in India's national interest. Just as I believe it's in India's national interest to keep reminding the world and ourselves about the basics of nuclear deterrence. That is something that we tend to forget. And there are 3 basics of nuclear deterrence I want to point out. One is that nuclear weapons are of a special kind. They are not, as you said, sir, conventional daisy cutters of a more lethal variety. Nuclear weapons fall in a completely different category. And let's not fall prey to any tendencies that tend to mix the two and conflate conventional and nuclear. Secondly, the horrors of nuclear use. What makes nuclear weapons special is the kind of dangers that come with nuclear use. The fact that you can't constrain their effect in time and space is something that we cannot forget. And because of the nature of the weapon, they are best suited only for deterrence, which is why when nuclear weapons exist, deterrence is a philosophy that we have to go by. And even then, nuclear weapons are best suited for deterrence by punishment, not for war fighting. And that's where India has a special take. Our doctrine is talking about credible minimum deterrence, not because it's the right thing to do. It's because that's the only reason why nuclear weapons need to exist. No first use, essentially because there is a military logic. It's not because India is a pacifist nation or the Gandhian land that we are talking about no first use. It's because there is no military logic of the use of nuclear weapons except for deterrence and deterrence by punishment. And our doctrine is saying massive retaliation to any use of nuclear weapons. So therefore, this, I think, misunderstanding that often creeps in, or complacency, or whatever you want to call it, this must be minimized. And I think one of the ways of doing that is to bring this into popular debate. Our popular literature does not talk about the effects of nuclear weapons use. We don't have movies which are made like The Day After, which talked about the use of nuclear weapons. And that's, I think, one way of bridging the gap. Thank you, sir.
I mean, it's a good point, but the point is that, Sheel, there is a reality, and there is a lack of trust. So while you keep trying, we also have to accept that this kind of trust will not happen in our lifetimes, and we can't be sure it will happen in our children's lifetimes. Our children are grown up now. and there is a lack of moral authority. I mean, you go to a classroom in a university now, I bet 95%, I mean, I don't want to embarrass this audience by asking for a show of hands, will not know the name of the Secretary General of the UN today. So there's a decline of global systems, there's a decline of global institutions and leadership. That's the reality. Second, deterrence. See, you've now come to a complicated zone. Because when we said deterrence in the nuclear debate, it was to deter the other guy from using nuclear weapons against you. Today, you have at least 3 countries using nuclear weapons to deter the other from using not just conventional methods, but even diplomatic methods or methods of trade. So this is the putting the gun on your head and negotiating with the world strategy. And people are getting away with it. So you have to deal with that first. I mean, Americans and Russians have all this stuff. You can watch the movies, right? They are too far. But this is now a new reality, and it's a matter of time before other countries also learn from this and go in that direction.
I think first on the idea of non-state actors, I completely agree with Shekhar. There is no such thing. It was a euphemism that was created. There is no, you actually, if you think deeply about it, you will find that there is no non-state actor which does not have, in some form or another, some state backing it. And the other thing, I mean, you know, about covert actions. The problem with covert actions is, yes, you can take covert actions, but covert actions are normally are done in a manner in which they are not attributed. So will that satisfy the public mood? Not necessarily. So there is the politics of the public mood, which doesn't necessarily get satisfied by covert action in that sense. And finally, I mean, Shekhar is absolutely right once again about deterrence. The notion of deterrence that existed between US and Soviet Union attributed a certain role to nuclear weapons. Today, new players who have nuclear weapons attribute different kinds of roles to their nuclear weapons in their security calculus. We, on our side, have categorically stated that for us, nuclear weapons, it does not address all our security threats. It only addresses a limited threat of nuclear use or nuclear threat, nuclear blackmail. That's what it is intended to deter. And therefore, when deterrence equations are unbalanced, this is where you start getting the unraveling of the order that we are trying to address.
Okay, I think it's my pleasure to bring this discussion to close. And no, sir, please, we're finished with the. Before I ask Samir to say the last words for this evening, I just wanted to say 3 things. I think what we can take away from here. I think the first one, Ambassador Shamsaran said, nuclear order is linked to the larger global order. And I would read global order as global balance of power. The cast of characters in the balance of power have changed. China has a risen power today. Russia has a declining power in many ways. So the characters who are shaping this balance have changed. The technologies are changing. The strategies are changing. So therefore, we're not in the old situation. Therefore, India needs to adapt from a highly theoretical, wishful thinking of unable to see what your strategies and what your propaganda is. And I think we need to get out and lay out quite a clear case for relating to, if India is going to be the 3rd largest economy soon, with the 3rd largest military manpower, 5th largest defense budget, even though all of it goes to salaries. But the fact is that we need to change the way we relate to this order by actively participating in shaping the balance. I think that's my first point. The second point is about what Shekhar said about reform. The Chinese have a proverb, which is the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. That is, if we don't start defense reform, structural reform, which Rakesh talked about, Shekhar talked about, from acquisition to strategy to manpower to technology, are we going to be continuously marginalized in the game that others are playing? There's no debate on AI. There's no debate on new technologies that are coming up. It's like we have completely gone, the media, as Shekhar said, is only interested in the question of who's bought a weapon and who's got the card. So I think it's really a pathetic state for a country that spends $50 billion on defense. So I think reform. If we don't do reform, we're going to be in serious trouble. Finally, on deterrence, I think there's a lot of mumbo jumbo around the nuclear doctrine, which is none of it is proven. Used only once, so no first use is already worked, so we don't have to really worry about it. So I think let's not get too trapped in the theory of deterrence that was promulgated. North Koreans have used it brilliantly. The Pakistanis have turned it around in different ways. So I think let's be practical about this and not get too trapped in the theory, the grand words. And finally, to Rakesh, everybody has praised him today, so maybe as a friend I can say something critical. That I've been badgering him since he retired, saying, look, where is your book? Now, this is an edited book, but I think this inner Rakesh is still, as a real book, a book about India's nuclear diplomacy, with which he's involved. So I hope he will come up with on the ORF will get the next book on India's nuclear diplomacy and India's nuclear history. So Rakesh, I think that's my last suggestion to you.